Hi, now in today's presentation, the objective for today is exploring a range of mechanisms by which altruism is avoided. Now, in this presentation, what we will cover is the collapse of compassion, diffusion of responsibility, the decision process in Latin and Dali's 1968 cognitive model, Sullivan's bystander calculus model, social responsibility norm, fear of social blunders, situational influences, and mood. Now finally, throughout this presentation, we will be looking at lab experiments and real-life situations where altruism is avoided. Now firstly, I want you to think about these two quotes. The first one was by Joseph Stalin, which was, "One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic." Now the second quote was by Mother Teresa, who said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will." Now, in short, what these quotes mean is that people actually feel less emotion towards multiple victims than they do single victims. And this is what the collapse of compassion is. And there are many studies that have looked at this difference between singles and multiple victims. The studies suggest that people help less towards larger groups in order to reduce feeling overwhelmed by what they see. This can explain why some people avoid altruistic behaviour. They suppress their emotion and thus collapse of compassion occurs. The collapse of compassion can explain why altruism is avoided in larger groups. However, what happens when the sufferer is an individual? Now we're going to watch a video where an individual needed help but doesn't receive it.
Last time, security specialist Bill Stanton put two parents to the test to see if what they've taught their kids about the danger of strangers would serve them in a real-life situation. Today, he puts the public to the test. With the help of 7-year-old Raquel, Bill staged an abduction to see if the public would take action. Raquel's mom, Deborah, watched from a surveillance van as Raquel was approached by Bill.
Hey, where were you, young lady?
It's unbelievable, but they did nothing. Bill and Raquel repeated this time after time.
Hey,
Please, someone help me! You're not like that! Please, someone help me! You're not like that!
Still,
Please!
no response.
It's frightening that nobody would help.
One woman walked right by, believing someone else would take action.
never go away from me. You hear me? Don't ever go
And why didn't she do anything?
You think that someone else will take the blame, someone else will take the
So,
responsibility.
for the next part of the presentation, we're going to be looking at why people might avoid altruistic behaviour towards individuals in need of help. First, looking at the diffusion of responsibility. Now, in a world where if you are unfortunate enough to be a victim of a crime or are unwell, you might think being surrounded by lots of people, someone would intervene. Now, in fact, research actually suggests often a victim is less likely to seek assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the responsibility to someone else. This is called the diffusion of responsibility. She was a victim of violent crime on March the 13th, 1964, where she was attacked and as many as 28 neighbours could see or hear the incidents. However, each thinking the other would handle it, they all did nothing. In the time it took to be reported, her attacker had left and came back, sexually assaulted her and killing her. Her death is credited for prompting the initial investigation of bystander effect and the diffusion of responsibility. Other researchers have also suggested the effects of a confusion of responsibility, where bystanders fail to help someone in distress because they don't want to be mistaken for the cause of that distress. Another reason suggested why bystanders don't intervene in an emergency is because they are misled by the reaction of the people around them. Latin and Dali tested this. They ran an experiment in which they asked participants to fill out a questionnaire in a laboratory room. After participants had gotten into work, smoke filtered into the room, which was a clear signal of danger. During the experiment, participants were either alone, with 2 other participants they didn't know, or with 2 Confederates who completely ignored the smoke. Results showed that when participants were alone, the vast majority reported the smoke. However, when participants were in small groups, they were significantly less likely to report the smoke. Participants noted the smoke, looked to the others, assumed that they were unconcerned because of their inaction, and therefore decided that this probably wasn't an emergency, so didn't act. By examining behaviours of other strangers that don't display intervention, it makes it very difficult to rebel from them. Now, in this experiment previously mentioned, the participants themselves were in danger. So Latin and Roden extended the argument to situations where others might be in danger. Male participants were alone or in pairs, filling in a questionnaire where they heard a woman in another room struggling to open a filing cabinet. They then heard a loud crash, followed by a cry and some moans. Participants who were alone, 70% helped. When in pairs, 40% of the time they would help. With a Confederate, only 7% of the time they would help. So what does this mean? Well, it suggests that the situation a person is in isn't critical in determining if they will help or not, because the same findings are found in a variety of different experiments in different settings. But how is it some people help and others don't? Is there a process that we go through to decide whether we should avoid or proceed in altruistic behaviour? Latin and Dali suggested the decision process, which is a cognitive model which helps explain this. The model consists of 5 stages a person must proceed in order to help. In this case, we're examining them in relation to why people would avoid helping someone else. The first decision is attend to what is happening. The second is to define the event as an emergency. The third is for the bystander to assume responsibility. The fourth is deciding what can be done. And the final decision is whether to proceed in helping. Now, looking at all the stages, decision 2 incorporates fear of social blunders very well, as a person may witness an event but avoids getting involved as they do not want to appear foolish by overreacting. The influence of other people is clearly a determining factor on whether or not others will help in decision 2 and 3. Decision 4 incorporates personal abilities, which can explain why some people may not help because they don't know what to do. We're now going to look at a good example of where a woman demonstrates the different stages. So, from what we have covered so far, we can identify the influence of others is very important when avoiding altruistic behaviour. There is another model suggested by Pilivin et al., which is where bystanders calculate costs and benefits of providing help. There are 3 stages. The first stage is physiological arousal. That while a person witnesses an emergency, they are physiologically aroused. By doing so, the greater this is, the greater the chance of the witness will help the person in need. The second stage is labelling the arousal. Now generally, arousal doesn't automatically produce specific emotions. A person's thoughts about the arousal plays a critical role in determining the nature of the emotion they feel. There are usually two sets of responses: personal distress or empathetic concern. Now, personal distress is experiencing an anxiety when seeing someone else upset, and empathetic concern is experiencing compassion towards another person. Pillivan suggested bystanders label physiological arousal as personal distress, and therefore are more likely to help. The final stage is evaluating the consequences of helping the person in need. A person will weigh up the costs of helping by choosing the action that reduces their personal distress to the lowest cost. The main costs of helping are time and effort. What do you think about the different models? Do you think one is better at explaining why people avoid altruistic behaviour? Or do you think they're the same? Or do you disagree with something within the models? Discuss in small groups. Previously, we've looked at the presence and behaviour of others can lead to the failure of bystanders to help in emergency situations. However, what about how people attribute a person in need? People may avoid altruism because of how they view the person in need. So, under some conditions, people do not help and may even blame an innocent victim for the situation they are in. According to the just world hypothesis, people have a need to believe, perhaps maybe for their own security, that the world is a just place where people get what they deserve. If, for example, someone had an accident, it may have been deserved. Consequently, if some victims deserve their fate, which means that blame is attributed to them, the bystander is less likely to help. For example, applying this to Kitty's case, some of the witnesses may have well believed it was her fault for being out so late. This is a familiar response to many crimes. A rape victim, for example, might have deserved what happened because her clothes were too tight or revealing. Now, the social responsibility norm suggests that help should be given freely to those in need without regards to future exchanges. Consistent with the just world hypothesis, the social responsibility norm dictates that we should give to people in line with what they deserve. For example, if a person is a victim of a natural disaster, by all means, help. Whereas if they are drunk and injure themselves by falling over, they should get what they deserve. Now that we have covered the presence of others, attribution towards people, can the mood you're in affect your altruistic behaviour? Research says yes. People who feel bad, sad or depressed are internally focused. They concentrate on themselves, their problems and their worries, which means they're less concerned of the welfare of others and so help others less. The final mechanism we will look at is time. Schedules, deadlines, events, occasions are all part of human life and affect most people in their day-to-day living. A study which tested time and helping behaviour was Darley and Batson, Good Samaritan study. Students had to walk across campus to give a speech where they were made to believe they were quite late, just on time or early. They were given the opportunity to help a man who had apparently collapsed in an alley. Students with plenty of time, 60% offered help, and if they were running late, only 10% offered help. Situational influences such as time have a strong influence on whether or not people will help others. In this situation, an emergency may be noticed. Altruistic behaviour is avoided due to a person's personal schedule. This is an important mechanism to consider in environments like cities, because people in cities are constantly bombarded with stimulations, so they may keep to themselves to avoid being overwhelmed. It may also be possible that being in these busy environments, you miss out situations where you could help someone because you're internally focused. A good lab experiment that demonstrate selective attention is Simon and Chabaris, gorillas in our MIST experiment, where participants were instructed to count how many times players wearing white passed a basketball to each other. In real life, we may block out helping others as our attention is focused somewhere else. For example, a businessman may miss a woman who had fallen over because he's concentrated on getting to work on time. Overall, we have learned that it's not nice to think, as humans, our tendency for altruism can depend on things such as presence of others, mood, time and attention, and much more. But as previously mentioned, these scientific findings force us to consider how we would perform under pressure. It becomes easier to understand how people remain silent against the horrors around them.